People should not underestimate the power of the Communist Manifesto. This is the introduction. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Does that sound like an economic text to you?
No. Sounds like a declaration of war.
Yeah, I've been listening to a lot of podcasts about communism, and I started diving into the Communist Manifesto, and there's an easy argument to be made that it's more of a religious text than an economic text. And, that the introduction to it is a perfect example of that. Dive into some other parts that I found interesting. So, if you read the Communist Manifesto, it kind of paints this picture of these two classes, the bourgeois and the proletariat. The proletariat is the working class, and they're kind of painted as the class that's just really harvested for their labor. And then the bourgeois is the class that controls the resources and the means of production. So this is from Communist Manifesto. The bourgeois, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. The cheap prices of its commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. So, Marx is kind of painting the bourgeois as this group of people that are forcing the entire world to adopt their mode of operation, which is this kind of industrialization and control of the means of resources and the control of the proletariat as the working class. I found this next passage extremely interesting. But that was another example of a passage where it's like, this is not an economic text where they're going, here's the statistics. This is, there's not even like basic psychological principles in there. It's basically just saying there's this force, this group of people out there that's, like spreading across the world, forcing all societies to operate their mode of operation. And the way it's worded, like, the cheap prices of its commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls. It's like painting this as this war between these classes and between these different modes of operation. This next one. Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer, who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. For many a decade past, the history of industry and commerce is but the history of the revolt of modern productive forces against modern conditions of production, against the property relations that are the conditions for the existence of the bourgeois and of its rule. It is enough to mention the commercial crisis that by their periodical return put on its trial, each time more threateningly, the existence of the bourgeois society. In these crises, a great part not only of the existing products, but also of the previously created productive forces is periodically destroyed. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions, by which they are fettered. And so soon as they overcome these fetters, they bring disorder into the whole of bourgeois society and endanger the existence of bourgeois property. The conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. And how does the bourgeois get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces, on the other, by the conquest of new markets, and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. So, I mean, that was a lot there, but basically what Marx is saying there is the bourgeois-controlled society produces too much society, too much subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. He's basically saying the bourgeois is too effective at producing material goods, commerce. Bro, that was a ridiculous reaction. Come on.
It's just sitting in my chair now. I gotta get it off.
That was an embarrassing reaction.
My reaction was to slap it.
You spazzed out.
I didn't spazz out. I had to get up and get it off my chair.
All right, we had a momentary disruption from a stink bug. But, yeah, so basically what he's saying is that this bourgeois mode of society is too effective at creating goods and commerce and prosperity, and the bourgeois can't wield all of that productive force. So they create these crises where they destroy a bunch of property, destroy a bunch of commerce. And he also said that they enforce the destruction of the massive productive forces, and they conquer new markets and exploit the old markets more. So to be completely honest, I don't even understand what he's really trying to say there. Like, they produce too much goods, so they go and conquer another market. That doesn't make any sense to me. If they already have too many goods to wield, why would they need to go conquer another market to fix that problem? That seems like a contradiction to me. But basically what this is hitting at is this method of running society is too prosperous. And I mean that explains why communism implemented often leads to the destruction of the means of production and is really good at just destroying the pie, shrinking the pie so that there's much less to go around. And it makes perfect sense if you read this passage, which is pointing out the fact that the bourgeois society produces too much, and that leads to the bourgeois, the people in power, according to Marx's story, to destroy a lot of those productive goods because they can't wield all those goods. Mm-hmm. The logic in that is extremely questionable, but that's the story that Marx is kind of painting here. And then briefly after that passage, like literally there's one sentence in between that passage and the next, he says, "But not only has the bourgeois forged the weapons that bring death to itself." Does that sound like an economic text right there? Forge the weapons that bring death to itself. "But not only has the bourgeois forged the weapons that bring death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians." So that passage right there encapsulates so much of what communism is. It's pointing out, so he's basically saying the bourgeois mode of society has produced far too much productive commerce and trade, and the bourgeois can't handle all of it, And the proletariat, which is the working class, is going to be the class that rises up and takes control of all of this industrial means of production that the bourgeois have created, that they can't control any longer. So it's creating this story of the proletariat as like the chosen ones that are going to take control of the means of production. This is exactly what happens when communism is implemented. The proletariat comes in and forcefully evicts the bourgeois from controlling the means of production. The proletariat basically just ransacks all of the means of production, and then that's what led to the wide-scale famines that killed millions of people in the Soviet Union and in Mao's China. The proletariat comes in, takes control of the means of production, ransacks everything. They're no longer able to create goods anymore, and then that's what leads to the horrors that come from communism. So he paints this potent story about the struggle between these two classes that's all just about power and oppression, and talks about how the bourgeois can no longer control and the proletariat is going to stand up. Another thing, that this is in the first chapter of the Communist Manifesto, he says, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." So that kind of sets the entire context of the story that communism tells, which is all history is just about class struggles, nothing else. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. So they're reducing all of human society down to just a story about class struggles, and the story that Marx tells is about the bourgeois and the proletariat, and how the proletariat need to rise up and replace the bourgeois mode of society because it's too productive, produces too much commerce. It's quite astounding, the story that he tells. You haven't read through this obviously yet, no. So do you have any thoughts on what we've kind of gone through?
I mean, from what you've read so far, it's not sounding like an economic text. I wouldn't say it sounds like a religion either. It sounds more like just like a philosophy. And communism is an economic philosophy, so it's kind of sounding that way. It is sounding quite severe, and he's quite black and white with what he says. I haven't heard a single example. Like, he's not trying to relate this to his own experiences yet or anything like that. So I'd be eager to know if he eventually does give an example of the bourgeois and the proletariat in a society, and them, overtaking the bourgeois and the proletariat. I don't know. I just feel like there hasn't been any examples yet, and he's just kind of going with the train of thought that is debatable.
Yeah, I mean, I've just read a couple passages, and he does dive into specific examples at certain points.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting the way that he words things, and the depicting it as this sort of war between the different classes, and it's all just about power. And the statement that the bourgeois the bourgeois mode of society, controlled mode of society, produces too much, and that is a problem for the ruling class is a very compelling idea, I would say, but an extremely debatable idea. I mean, we know that there is a small minority of people that command the majority of wealth in any human society. So he has a point. I mean, there is a small minority of people that are going to command most of the resources. I mean, you're going to have the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezoses, who are billionaires, and these tech monopolies, like that these things do exist. So that's why part of the reason why the story is so compelling. But Marx's solution to that is the oppressed rising up and taking control of all the means of production, and then distributing everything evenly. So it's that solution has led to some absolute horrors in the 20th century. I also wanted to just briefly touch on the an insight into kind of who Karl Marx was as a person and what he believed. One of his most one of the quotes that he inspired most is from Goethe's Faust, and there's a character in Faust called Mephistopheles, and Mephistopheles has the quote, "All that exists deserves to perish." And Karl Marx greatly admired this quote, and I think he used it quite frequently. And just the level of darkness of that quote is, unquestionable. You can't put a happy spin on that quote. All that exists deserves to perish. And, that ties in greatly with his communist ideas. To implement communism, you have to try to eliminate the memory of what society used to be able to implement the ideas of communism. So part of communism, and this is played out in reality, every time it's implemented, you see widespread killing and re-education of millions and millions of people because they have to destroy what has been. And then this goes into the quote that Kamala Harris loves so much. She says, "What can be unburdened by what has been?" And that's, like a more fun kind of spin on this same idea, but it's the same idea that you need to completely replace and forget about what has been to be able to implement this new utopia that communism and Marxism is supposed to bring about. And it's incredibly dark, but we're seeing Marxism infiltrate all facets of society right now, especially in the West, where they're using this same victimizer, oppressor, oppressed story, and they're applying it to things like gender and race more than it's ever been applied. So we're seeing this with critical race theory and gender identity. What's kind of playing out in the gender realm is the LGBTQ plus community is coming in and saying, oh, all of these gender identities, these sexual identities that haven't been considered normal for all of human history, that's because they're being oppressed and victimized by the people that have considered themselves normal gender, normal sexuality. And so now these oppressed genders and sexualities need to become empowered, and we need to throw away the old mode of gender identity and implement this new one where you could be whatever you want, infinite possibilities. We're seeing it with the feminism movement where women have been oppressed for all of human history by men, and now women need to rise up and become empowered, and women need to be the ones in power now. So it's the same victimizer, oppressor, oppressed story that they're applying to all these different areas now of gender and of sex, and the left is having an absolute field day with this right now. They're obsessing over raising up these groups of people by whatever separation they want to use, and they're saying these people need to rise up and become empowered now because all of history has been oppressing them. And so it's the same Marxist communist idea of destroying the past. I mean, what have we been seeing in the past couple of years in the United States? People tearing down statues, calling out all historic figures for being evil. It's truly crazy how much Marxism is still around. And I was listening to Jordan Peterson talk about on an interview that he was describing it as the of Marxism metastasizing. So metastasizing is when cancer cells in the body break away and go to a different area of the body. So it's almost like these same Marxist victimizer ideas have left the economic realm, which they were so heavily a part of in the 20th century, and they've metastasized and they've gone to these other areas, these cultural areas of gender and race. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the West right now. And we're also seeing the rise of censorship, which is a key component of communism, because if you want to implement communism, like I said, you need to eliminate the memory of what has been with what can be. And the only way you can do that is by censoring everybody, re-educating everybody, taking control of the schools, eliminating freedom of expression and freedom of information. And that's why these same Marxist type thinkers are ruthlessly attacking any free speech platforms and individuals that are promoting free speech right now. They're trying to slowly implement this censorship so that they can implement these Marxist ideas that they've been possessed by. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I feel like you have a clear amount of stuff you want to... You got a stink bug landing on you?
These dudes are insane, bro. He just flew right into my face.
Yes, the communists are also flooding our neighborhood with stink bugs. I'm absolutely disgusted by how many stink bugs I'm seeing.
Stink bugs are the bug version of communists. They just keep coming at you. No matter how many times you swat them away, they keep finding ways to come back. Yeah, I mean, when I'm talking about communism and Marxist ideas, I like to take the kind of intellectual approach, hearing out the ideas, trying to figure out what Marx was really about, trying to empathize with, is that even a word, empathize? Trying to be empathetic towards the people that wield some of these Marxist ideas, these socialist, communist ideas. But the more you dive into it, the more you realize how truly dark this stuff is. And it's been played out in reality with tens of millions of people dying in the 20th century from famine and being put in re-education camps, being tortured ruthlessly by the communist regimes. This stuff is unbelievably dark. And so, while I do like to hear some of these ideas out, I don't think the right attitude to have towards communism is anything but disgust of how dark these ideas are. And again, Marx's favorite quote, "All that exists deserves to perish." That is a diabolical quote. And I do want to dive a little bit more into this resentful spirit that seems to possess people that are obsessed with the idea of communism and obsessed with the idea of the victimizer. The story of Cain and Abel, which is in the Bible, is a story about the two sons of Adam and Eve. Abel was a shepherd and Cain was a farmer. Both offered sacrifices to God. Abel brought the best portions of his flock to God as an offering. Cain offered some of the fruits of his soil. So he was kind of like halfway, like, okay, I'll try a little bit. I'll give you some of my stuff. God was extremely pleased with Abel's offering because Abel gave it his all. He brought God the best that he had. Mm-hmm. God was not pleased with Cain because Cain did not give God the best that he had. Out of jealousy and anger, Cain lured Abel into a field and killed him. When God asked Cain where his brother was, Cain responded with the famous line, "Am I my brother's keeper?" God, being all-knowing, knew what Cain did and cursed him to be a restless wanderer. So, this is such a powerful story, and it's the story of resentment. So, Abel gave God his all, and God rewarded him for it. Cain didn't give it his all, and God punished him for it. And due to this, Cain became resentful and decided to kill his brother, to kill the person that gave his all. And this is the spirit of resentment, and it's encapsulated in the Bible because resentment is such a powerful human force. And this is jam-packed with meaning, but you could argue that the people that are most likely to become resentful and murderous are the ones that have been punished or feel that they have been punished by God or a higher power. You see this with the victim mentality. It's like, why, like, I feel so bad for myself. Like, why, I don't deserve this. Why is people, a lot of victimizers will consider themselves atheists, so they won't directly say, like, why has God done this to me? But they often feel that they've been taken advantage of, and then they're able to direct this resentment towards the people that they feel to be the oppressor. And Cain, in this example, felt that Abel was, I mean, I don't think he directly identified him as an oppressor, but Cain certainly didn't like the idea that God was favoring Abel over him. And that's kind of what, that is the oppressed narrative. It's like Cain felt that he was being oppressed by God, and he felt that Abel was being promoted as the oppressor, and that's what you see, the narrative that you see play out in reality, and that's what's happening right now with Marxism in the racial and gender spheres. It's like certain women have become extremely resentful towards men because they feel that men have been favored by God for all of human history and kind of propped up as the oppressor of females, which is just a ridiculous story. And one of the things, like, listening to Jordan Peterson, he always points out the fact that the communist story, the Marxist story, is obsessed with the idea that everything is about power. And that's what, Marx basically says in the Communist Manifesto. All history is about class struggle. It's all about this power struggle between the classes. So it's a reductionist way of viewing reality where you can easily identify oppressed, oppressor in any situation in life, and then you can argue that the oppressed has the right to become resentful towards the oppressor and overthrow them. That's the story of resentment. That's the story of communism. That's the story of Marxism, and that's the story of Cain and Abel. And these spirits don't go away. They keep coming back. We always see them popping up in different ways. I want to tie this into a Carl Jung quote where he says, we talked about this in another podcast, but the archetypes. Carl Jung says the archetype is a kind of readiness to produce over and over again the same or similar mythical ideas. So the story of Cain and Abel are each archetypes. Abel is the archetype of giving it your all and being rewarded by God. Cain is the story of not giving it your all, being punished for that, and then becoming resentful and blaming God and blaming some other group of people for oppressing you. So this spirit of resentment is an archetype that is always ready to produce over and over again, and you see it pop up in different examples. For example, we know, maybe we shouldn't even talk about this topic in the podcast. Anyways, children always have the propensity to become resentful towards their parents. And so sometimes children will grow up and they'll be very unhappy with their circumstances and unhappy about who they became as a person. And they'll, instead of taking responsibility for this, they'll develop this resentment towards their parents, blaming their parents for all of their problems. And that's kind of what we see in the person that we know. I don't want to dive too much into the specifics, but you see this happen all the time. People will fail, and then they'll become resentful about it and just direct that towards some person that they feel is responsible for their failure. That's exactly what Cain was doing in that story in the Bible. And it's what Marxists love to do. They love to point out, this ruling class has just been oppressing us this whole time. They're the reason why we're poor. They're the reason why we're struggling. We need to overthrow them. And that they become obsessed and they become possessed by this story of resentment. And there's countless examples of this archetype playing out. Can you think of any movie examples, movie characters? I'm sure we can draw upon some.
Resentful movie characters?
Yeah.
Definitely have to edit out the long pause here because my brain was not thinking movies for the last 30 minutes.
There's got to be so many movie examples of resentful. Here's a good example. What did you say?
That was referencing the Joker.
I think the Joker's certainly one. Well, we can talk about the Joker, but what popped into my head is Anakin Skywalker. Yeah. Anakin Skywalker develops this intense resentment towards the Jedi Order and towards his master, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and falls to the dark side pretty much and falls under the guidance of Chancellor Palpatine, and the Chancellor Palpatine actually tells the story of the other Sith Lord, right, who killed his own master out of resentment.
Yeah.
It's a very common story for evil individuals to become resentful towards the person that taught them everything they know and taught them how to become skilled and tried to teach them wisdom. They fall to the dark side, they become resentful and then kill their masters. Kylo Ren in The Rise of Skywalker becomes resentful towards his own father and kills his own father. Like, that is the ultimate manifestation of resentment, is when resentment takes you to the point where you kill your own parents. Mm-hmm. That's a very... Karl Marx, for example, didn't go to his own father's funeral.
So he hated his own father?
There's a debate to be had about that, but what does that say about a person when they don't go to their father's own funeral? Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, it's very interesting, the potency of resentment and how it pops up. The story of Joker is like the ultimate resentment, right? The Joker becomes resentful towards all of civilization and then just...
And keep in mind, we're talking about I think the best example is that most recent Joker movie. Because other depictions of the Joker, he's just like insane. Mm-hmm. But in that recent movie, he was more like mentally ill and suffered for it and became resentful to society for it.
He became extremely resentful towards that talk show host, right?
Yeah.
For making fun of him.
Yeah.
And then, and kind of went down the journey becoming resentful towards all of society. Same thing with the movie Taxi Driver, right? Becomes extremely resentful towards the woman that rejected him, extremely resentful towards the politicians, and really just expresses his disgust with all of the city.
Taxi Driver's a lot more nuanced, though, and a lot more interesting, because I don't know if it's necessarily resentment. I think he's an outcast in that movie, and he doesn't want to be an outcast. So, like, you see him taking efforts to try and belong more in society, but they keep failing.
That's the story of the resentful spirit, right?
However, his ultimate act was arguably a good one. He attacks all those people at that establishment. I think they were just like sex trafficking or something, and he kills all those people. And the part of the movie that's up for debate is whether or not like all that happened, because there's a very obscure ending where like you're not sure if he's even dead or alive at that point. So
I think it's complete. I think it's entirely arguable as to whether that was a good action to go and just kill a bunch of people.
Yeah, no, 100%. But I'm saying, like, compared to the Joker, where he's just killing a talk show host and causing absolute mayhem in the city, there's two different endings there.
Yeah, I'm just trying to point out the fact that it's all about the story of resentment.
Yeah,
murderous resentment.
Yes,
and that's the story of Cain and Abel. Murderous resentment towards the people that are favored by God. Right? Mm. This spirit of resentment is like, it kind of lurks in everybody and has the ability to be activated. I think all human beings have the ability to become resentful. I don't think anybody's immune from the force of resentment. But you have to be able to look inside of yourself and go, why am I taking these actions? Am I taking these actions out of resentment? And if you do identify the fact that you're taking certain actions out of resentment, you need to really stop and check yourself, because as all these stories show, resentment can lead to murderous resentment, which is what you see with the school shooters. They become so resentful towards the way that they're treated by the world that they decide to go on a murderous rampage through the school. So it's incredibly dark, but it's so powerful that the fall from paradise, the story of Adam and Eve, is the first story in the Bible, but the second is Cain and Abel. So that shows how important the force of resentment is, how important it is to be aware of it. That's the second story that we see play out in the Bible, is the story of resentment, the story of murderous resentment. And if you are ignorant to this force of resentment, you are in a dangerous place, because first of all, you could be possessed by the force of resentment and not even know it. Or you could become the target of somebody else's resentment, murderous resentment. And everybody knows this, because when you're in school, the kid that's bullied all the time ruthlessly, and there's always kids that are bullied ruthlessly, there's a thought process that goes on in your head. Maybe I should befriend this person because they're being ruthlessly bullied. That might lead them down the path of murderous resentment. Like, they might become the next school shooter. There's a thought process that goes on in your head that this person could become prey to this murderous resentment. I don't even think it's a conscious thought. Like, for me personally, it wasn't a conscious thought process that went through my head, but you're always having the thought process, like, maybe I shouldn't push this person, or maybe this person's being bullied by everybody. Maybe I should be careful about, not contributing to that, because this person could become extremely resentful and perhaps violent. So I think there is a subconscious process that goes on in the brain, but you need to be aware. That's another great Carl Jung quote that I'll pull up real quick. He's basically talking about on the need to be conscious of the forces that are working inside of you. Yes, he says, until you make the unconscious conscious, it sounded weird. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So he's kind of hitting at the fact that there's these mythical forces, these archetypes that are at play inside of us. But if you don't make it conscious, you'll call it fate. So, like, the resentful Marxist might not fully know that there's this unconscious force working inside of them, but they do feel that their fate is to overthrow the oppressors. And you see this in Marxist thinkers, is they have this obsession with overthrowing the unfortunately, since the Marxist ideas, the Marxist spirit has moved into the realm of race, I think a lot of black people have fallen prey to this resentful force, because they're being told over and over again that they're the oppressed class that's been oppressed for all of American history, and now they need to overthrow the people, the white people that are oppressing them. So I think a lot of black people have been, I guess you could say, infiltrated by this force. And I think some have broken out of it, but I think some are still kind of unconscious as to what this force is that's working inside of them. And I'm not saying that, like, all black people are just, like, resentful and bitter now, but you do see a certain portion of them, and, like, I've seen it in my own life just with African American people that I know. They start to fall into this oppressor-oppressed narrative and start to become resentful towards white people. And it's incredibly unfortunate that, like, I feel bad for people that become possessed by these forces, because they are really powerful forces. Like, if you read the Communist Manifesto, even if you completely disagree with it and you recognize the evil that lurks inside of it, it is a very compelling story for someone that has been oppressed. I'm a part of the oppressor white class, so it's hard to understand how powerful those ideas might be to someone who's oppressed. You kind of have to imagine like I'm part of a group and I'm being told that I've been oppressed for all of this time, and I could see myself falling prey to that resentful attitude. They're doing the same thing with gay people and people that feel that they're a different gender. They're telling them, oh, you've just been oppressed by society, and you should, maybe try to overthrow the gender norms that have been around for so long. And these people become extremely resentful towards. I think a lot of the resentment gets directed towards like Christianity. A lot of it gets directed towards Christianity because Christianity is not really accepting of being gay. So they direct a lot of that resentment towards Christianity. They direct it towards people that are straight. What were you going to say?
I was going to say that, yes, there's a lot of telling people that they're oppressed and maybe even telling them who they're oppressed by, but they're not telling people to overthrow the things that are oppressing. They don't need to. Like they're just telling them that they're oppressed, and then those forces just begin to manifest naturally, I think, because I don't think there's any, like, I'm trying to think of, like, leaders in those groups just outright saying that we need to overthrow these particular things. They don't even need to be that outright with it.
Can be unburdened by what has been.
That's Kamala. She's not saying that pertaining to anything. She's saying that as like for everything.
What that quote is saying is that we need to unburden ourselves from what has been.
Yeah.
So we need to forget the systems that are in place already. So that's a call to overthrow the prior order. As nice as it sounds, that's a call to overthrow what has been.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is it's just very broad. Like, you were trying to, like, give, like, specifics.
Well, yeah, it is broad. It's infiltrated any...
Yeah. Like, I'm agreeing with you. I was just saying, like, they don't need to be as direct as saying, like, you're being oppressed by Christians, overthrow them. They're just telling you what you're being oppressed by, and then they have that message of needing to unburden, like you said, unburden yourselves from what has been. So, like, it all just kind of acts...
I think that's exactly what they're what they're calling for, is the overthrow of Christianity as a mode of religious operation. I would argue, I think the LGBTQ plus community has a deep hate and resentment towards Christianity, and they openly mock God and Jesus constantly.
Yes.
And the United States government successfully drove Christian religion out of the schools and has now implemented some of these new LGBTQ plus ideas into the schools. So I'm not saying that like they're calling for like a violent overthrow in the streets, but they're certainly trying to replace the prior modes of operation. I mean, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a direct attack on meritocracy, which is the way that this country has operated since its formulation. They want to implement a sort of equity where, that's the famous quote from the Communist Manifesto as well. I believe it's to each according to his need.
Yeah, like I'm
right?
in agreement with you. I was just trying
from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Yeah, you're trying to play like devil's advocate a little bit.
No, I'm not even trying to play devil's advocate. I'm just trying to make a point that it's not as direct as you're making it out to be. I think they're going about it a little bit more subtle than you're explaining.
I completely agree with that. It's more of a subtle.
Yeah,
they make everything try to sound nice and empathetic and happy and compassionate. Karl Marx was more like there's a specter.
Yeah, if they were
what I mean?
talking about their goals in the same way that the Communist Manifesto is written, I think this would be a lot more easy to detect.
But it almost makes it more dangerous because it's harder to detect. The Marxism.
That's the point I'm making. I'm saying they're going about this so subtly, or at least subtly enough, to where you can't even really fight this process. It's just happening. Like what they did in the schools, they've flushed out any religion, and now they're implementing what you could argue are almost religious. Yeah.
We need to use pronouns to be compassionate to the the non-gender binary individuals, and it's all about
They're changing
compassion.
language
We need to what
in the
can
name of
be
compassion.
unburdened by what has been. It's fun. It's happy. We're gonna just destroy everything that's ever been, but in like a kind of like a fun way,
But it's gonna
like a
unburden.
progressive way.
You don't want to be burdened. You want to be unburdened. So.
Yeah, there's too much talk about what has been. We need to just focus on the future and
If we want to relate this to movies, you got Disney going through all their old properties, and they're like, oh, it doesn't fit the modern world. These are outdated and prejudiced films. We need to make them fit our modern agenda, and they're all horrible, disgusting slop. So
yeah, it's a dangerous force that's really has a grip on the West now. And then simultaneously we have these Western countries importing millions and millions of immigrants from other countries. So that's also contributing to the destruction of what has been, because when you bring in millions of immigrants from a different culture, the culture of your country takes a massive hit from that for obvious reasons. It gets diluted and easier to destroy. So yeah, I mean, the Western world is under a ruthless attack from these Marxist ideas and all of the byproducts of these ideas, and it's got its tentacles across all of the different. Any way you can group people, essentially, is where they can apply this oppressed narrative, and then argue for the overthrow of the prior order, because the prior order allowed this oppressed dynamic to emerge. So we need to destroy everything that has been.
Implementing systems and ways of viewing the world that just put everyone into these tribes, and they're clearly, they want tribalism back, because it creates the
communism needs tribalism.
Yeah,
it needs that story of the bourgeois and the proletariat, men and women, straight people and non-binary people. It needs that. It needs the two sides to fit into that oppressed narrative, that Cain and Abel narrative.
It's why they don't want a middle class. They're destroying the middle class.
And what's scary is, while they're destroying the middle class, they're simultaneously trying to pretend that they're trying to bolster the middle class, when they're clearly not. They're clearly not trying to bolster the middle class. They're trying to eliminate the middle class, so that they can clearly point out this struggle between the classes and say we need to have the oppressed rise up and become empowered. That's what the idea of empowerment is.
This is insanity.
The idea of empowerment is the idea that the people that have not been in power need to rise up and take power.
It's on the back of your left shoulder now.
The stink bugs are clearly trying to become empowered and take control.
They've won. They have completely diluted the bug population.
Maybe they did. Stink bugs are like the lowly.
They're an
bugs
Asian infestation. Like, they're not indigenous.
Yeah.
And they've taken over. They're everywhere. It's disgusting. They're flying around everywhere. I hate this.
Anyways, I think this is a pivotal moment in history where people need to perhaps dive into some of these Marxist ideas, because if you don't understand them and understand what lies at the root of these ideas and the root of this resentment, then you're ignorant and naive, and
you're gonna be naive,
and you're gonna fall victim to this
to the evils that are at play. Like, if you just listen to what these people say, you're gonna think that their ideas sound somewhat appealing, but you have to understand what the root goal is.
Yeah. I hope enough people are privy to what is occurring, and I think more and more people are recognizing these forces and realizing what's going on here. And yeah, I mean, I think you can't have enough people talking about this kind of stuff. And the only way communism can be implemented is through mass censorship. So people need to resist mass censorship. They need to fight as hard as they can for freedom of speech. And if we can uphold freedom of speech, uphold what has been, which is the Constitution of the United States, we can continue to live in a free society, in a free and prosperous society. But yeah, I mean, these communists, these Marxists are they're trying to think of the right word to describe them, but they're a formidable foe. So these ideas are not to be taken lightly. They hold a lot of power, and they have the ability to possess anybody that considers themselves a victim or considers themselves a member of the oppressed. Yeah, I think that's a good place to stop.
Can wrap it up there.
Cool. Frasetto Brothers Podcast, Episode 5. Communism. Complete.